Good evening. We're delighted to welcome you to Belfast International Arts Festival and the first event in our Talks and Ideas strand this year, which is Stuart Maconie talking to Hugh Odling-Smee about his book, The Nanny State Made Me. And this event is brought by Belfast International Arts Festival in association with Westival. Stuart's book talks about the nanny state, the cradle-to-grave protections that were offered to British people for most of the 20th century and dismantled by the Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s, and how those political decisions still underpin the changes in British life today. On other political events for this year's festival, we have Helen Lewis talking about difficult women, those cantankerous women who have made so much progress in the 20th century in Britain and Ireland, including the women who helped to repeal the 8th Amendment to the Irish Constitution on abortion in 2018 and the change to the law on abortion in Northern Ireland last year. We have Kevin Maxwell and Nazir Afzal talking from different perspectives about the prejudice and race in the legal system, from both the point of view of a police officer and a prosecutor. We have Jenny Murray talking about weight, food and dieting. And our final event in the Talks and Ideas strand this year will be 2 days before the US presidential election. We'll have Professor Sarah Churchwell and Michelle Cressfield talking about Donald Trump's legacy, white supremacy and US civil rights in the context of the election. For now, please enjoy Stuart Maconie and Hugh Odling-Smee discussing The Nanny State Made Me.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Belfast International Festival Westival co-production. That's a Westival Festival down in Westport. And I'm delighted to be joined down the line from where, Stuart?
The northeastern corner of the Lake District, actually. I'm in Cumbria. I'm near Ullswater, yeah, where I am currently enjoying some fresh air, but also working on the revisions and tweaks to the book we're going to talk about ahead of the paperback next March, because as will become apparent, the subject matter of the book has become suddenly enormously relevant.
It's history has caught up with you.
So
this is the book that we're going to talk about. It's by Mrs. Stuart Maconie. It's called The Nanny State Made Me, The Story of Britain and How to Save It. And I should say that this book is available all over the place, but especially the festival booksellers, which are No Alibis on Botanic Avenue, the wonderful No Alibis on Botanic Avenue in Belfast, and Tertulia in Westport as well. And I believe that there will be signed copies available from those two bookshops as well. So you can get hold of the book. And for the next hour, we're going to tell you why you should read that book. So Stuart, normally I always start off these interviews by asking, who did you write this book for? But I'm delighted to say you're going to read a small extract. Is that right?
Yeah, why don't I read the actual introduction, as it sort of sets up in a little vignette what the book is about. So let's try that.
Okay.
That's the introduction.
Lovely.
London's skyline bristles with towers, old and new, bloody and sleek, sandstone and silicon, monuments to kings and to commerce. From the Amazonian giants of the city's money jungle to the high-rise canyons of Camden, visitor and native alike marvel at them, orient by them, lifting eyes from book or phone or feet as the train exhales into Euston, as the buzz crests Muswell Hill, as you jostle through the West End. Whenever I pace the narrow lanes of Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia, I look up for one in particular. It's a Grade 2 listed building, much more familiar and human in its dimensions than the boastful monoliths of Canary Wharf. It's had many names and many lovers. It looms over works by Ian McEwan, the Goodies, and Alan Moore. It is part of our shared national iconography. It is surely a symbol of something: glamour, vision, adventure, the white-hot future that was coming. Early in the 21st century, around about the time when we were realising that that particular future wasn't coming for most of us down below, I had lunch at the top of that tower in the restaurant that used to revolve, the restaurant of failed dreams, with the man who helped to build it. I was filming an interview with Tony Benn, grand old firebrand of the Labour movement, about the building's history. I was filming an interview with Tony Benn, the grand old firebrand of the Labour movement, about the building's history. In 1966, along with the holiday camp magnate Billy Butlin, as Postmaster General, Ben had opened what was then called the GPO, or General Post Office Tower, a new and thrilling addition to London's skyline, commissioned by the state, designed by civil servants, the draftsmen and architects of the Ministry of Public Buildings. Neither of those positions or organisations exist now. When a new Britain began to emerge at the end of the 1970s, as the first of what would become countless privatisations, the GPO tower became first the post office tower, then the telecom tower, and finally the BT tower. As Tony, Ben and I sat talking in the quiet restaurant Erie, closed to the public for decades, on the vague and spurious grounds of it being a terrorist target, I could sense the mounting anxiety of the slick, besuited PR man lurking nearby. Eventually, he sidled over to our table. Stuart, Tony, hi. I couldn't help noticing, guys, that you're referring to the building as the GPO Tower. He laughed nervously. It's not been that for an awfully long time, guys. Can I remind you, it's the BT Tower, as in British Telecom, who own it. Ben fixed him with a stare that combined pity and scorn. Excuse me, I oversaw the opening of this building. It was built using British labour and skills with the money of the British people who paid for it with their taxes. It belongs to them, and it always will. Margaret Thatcher took it from them and gave it to you when it was not hers to give. This is not your building, it's theirs. And he pointed to the streets below and the busy, swarming, preoccupied workers. And it was stolen from them. The PR man, wilting and tasting defeat, moved silently back into the shadows. Ben turned to me, rolled his eyes, and winked. At that point, the seed of this book was planted. What happened to the GPO Tower was the start of a story. And this is it. This is my story, your story, and how it was stolen from us.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Yes, normally if we had the roar of the crowd here, you'd get a round of applause at the end of that, I would imagine. But in these new times, you can just have an applause from me.
Thank you.
So this book is a story about that tells the story of the welfare state through your life, through where you lived, how you were educated, how you thrived as a cultural, musical writer and journalist, and so on. And it was interesting because it is so much about you and how you are, and many of us are kind of invested in that welfare state. But who did you write this book for? Who was in your mind when you were writing it?
Well, I think I was hoping it wasn't for the converted. I mean, I did realise that, it would appeal to people who are vaguely thinking along the same lines as me. Mm-hmm. But I think I wanted to make people realise, to kind of clarify in people's minds, maybe what they'd never thought of before, that we have for 40 odd years in Britain, the United Kingdom. I hesitate to say I'm not an expert in every part of the United Kingdom, but I know certainly the bit I know, England for sure. We've been sold a kind of false narrative, and we've swallowed it hook, line and sinker. Even people who consider themselves vaguely socialistic have swallowed this way of thinking that, as Margaret Thatcher said back in 1979, or whatever, there is no alternative. That what we did in Britain to dismantle the post-war consensus, to sell off everything from water to libraries to council houses, to privatise the trains, that massive ideological revolutionary thing that we did. We were told that it was commonsensical and obvious. And in fact, it wasn't. It was a very, very distinctive ideological thing to do. It was in its own way as ideological, I say in the book, as it was in its own way as dramatic an ideological revolution as the one they had in Iran in 1979. Yeah, it dismantled. Yeah, it took what we all thought of as the natural state of Britain, a fair and equitable country with a decent... I use the word welfare state, and it's actually more than welfare, but there's no one convenient term for all that public sphere, libraries, schools, etc. But welfare state kind of comes close to it. I think we haven't realised quite how much, and I don't think I had myself till I thought about it and thought, not only did we do this, we've done this pretty much alone in the Western world. And I'm starting to think more and more that it's the root cause of so many of our national problems, that wrong-headed thinking. You go to Scandinavia, I end the book in Norway with this sort of love letter to Norway. Norway, which has a conservative government, by the way. Norway is no communist hotbed. It's a reasonably right-wing country, Norway. It's reasonably conservative with a small c. But the Norwegians would never have dreamt of doing what we do, because you sense from the rest of Europe and the rest of the world to a degree, it's just not how a grown-up country behaves. And we're seeing it now at the moment. To sell off all your assets, to privatise the water supply and the trains. People, there's an encounter I had with the Stone Roses with a Swiss businessman who says to me, no, grown up, we're the most capitalistic country in the world. We own the trains, though. That's nuts. Yeah. So, I think I wanted to clarify in a non-party political way. It's bound to shape up in a party political way to a degree, because the Conservatives have been the architects of this, and Labour, to lesser or greater degrees, have resisted it. But I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted it to be a book about a philosophical thing that's happened in Britain, of almost an intellectual climate that I think is wrong-headed. It's not a book. It's not a criticism of capitalism, as I say in the book. I'm very happy for my clothes and pop music and curries to be made by dynamic entrepreneurial types. Yeah. But I don't think they should run the prisons and the water supply. And I think our worship of them has been costly. That's a roundabout way of saying I'm hoping it's a book for anyone. And I'm hoping in some ways it might be a book for someone who might be vaguely centrist in their politics and think, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought that, yes, we had a revolution. And it's taken us down a blind alley for 40 years.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think the effect on you has been, considering that you're very much part of this welfare state?
Well, that's interesting, because I owe my career to capitalism. I mean, I've had said this many times in a jokey way. I got a break at the New Musical Express because the New Musical Express did not care what school you'd been to, unlike Radio 4 or the broadsheet, I have to say, where what school you've been to is still very important. My accent and my educational background and my housing background, growing up on a council estate, did not matter one jot to the major players at IPC magazines. As long as I kept making the NME the biggest selling rock magazine in the world, they were happy. So in that, it was a fairly classless institution. So I do say at some point early on in the book, there's a section called A Short Love Letter to Capitalism, where I say, I don't mind proper capitalism. I don't mind proper competition. What I do mind is the fake competition that we have in Britain now, whereby it's cronyism. It's not real competition when Serco get handed the contract for that track and trace app, which they're not up to the job of, but they handed it because of cronyism. I don't mind. I have no problem with private enterprise if it's genuinely competitive. But you can't have a genuinely competitive water supply. You know what I mean? Yeah. You can't. It's a nonsense. Yeah. Unless on a daily basis I can get up and think, I wonder whose water I should have today. I think I'll have Bolivian water today, or I think I'll have Harry Smith water. It's a nonsense. So it's a fake competitiveness, and that's what bothers me. I got my break through, I guess, a real competitiveness. As I say, IPC magazines didn't care as long as I kept outselling the competition. But in more than that, my education, my house, the libraries that I educated myself in, I would not have had that education. A lot of people like me, like Caitlin Moran, who's in the book, and Simon Allen, we would not have had those benefits without a decent, what's become now called, the post-war consensus, that Britain that's started to be dismantled in 1979.
Yeah, and so sort of from my parents are English and from Yorkshire and Lancashire, funnily enough, across the Pennines, which is nice. Yeah. But they were born just before the war, 1934, 1935, and they worked for the NHS all their lives, and for universities and so on, Open University and things like that. And it's that sort of philosophy of kind of public ownership and the idea of service, I think, is one of the things. That's not to say that necessarily people who work in the private sector aren't good at their job or that sort of stuff. But that sort of post-war consensus that Margaret Thatcher then dismantled. And you mentioned the great and very bizarre Keith Joseph, the Mad Monk, as well. And that's the sort of revolutionary figures who were building that up. They seemed to be sort of unaware of the benefits, or maybe they saw the benefits as a threat. Do you think that was?
Well, I think to people like Keith Joseph, there were few benefits, because in a similar way to Jacob Rees-Mogg embodies it. No, this is not a man. I doubt if Jacob Rees-Mogg ever used a public library in his life. No. I mean, what need would he have? And Thatcher said this. Thatcher said things like, why do people need libraries? Can't they just buy books? It's a mindset. It's a fundamental misunderstanding. Having said that, I should say belatedly, although I think Thatcher and her policies is the kind of seedbed of all the disasters that this book chronicles.
Mm.
She's cut from a different cloth completely to the current bunch. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
we have no ideology whatsoever beyond their self-aggrandizement. I do think that Thatcher, this is not much of a compliment because I guess it also applies to Hitler, believed very strongly in what she believed very strongly in what she was doing, not simply to give jobs for her and her mates, but she genuinely believed it was better for the country. She was wrong, but she genuinely believed that. I don't think a jot of ideology has ever crossed Boris Johnson's mind. And that might be, some might say that's a good thing. Some might say ideology, Hitler proves that rampant ideology is not a great thing. But it's an interesting thing. Thatcher certainly had that ideological thing. And to answer, to go back to what you said about it involves my experiences, I was also very aware that my books in the past and my public persona, if I have one, I come from a pop culture background. I do a lot of work in the entertainment field. And I know that my readers did not want 300 pages of undiluted fiscal analysis. They didn't want a white paper. I wouldn't want to read that. They didn't want a white paper. There are lots of brilliant writers who write in that way. I knew that for this to be fun for me to write and fun for them to read, it would be my story as well. So there's stuff about, me growing up in public parks and libraries and stuff like that. Yeah.
But it is emotional, and it is an emotional connection for a lot of people. I mean, I think of sort of after the miners' strike, and after the sort of the destruction, which was very much a sort of product of this ideology as well, about centers of power and communal living and all those kind of ideas. There became a kind of emotional spasm after that. So you saw films like Brassed Off. You had like the 30th anniversary of the miners' strike. There were huge amounts of writing about how emotional it was and how different it was. And Pride is a good example of that as well. That sort of mixing of kind of radicalism and all those kind of radical movements from the early 1980s. But it was a very emotional sort of spasm, and a kind of that connection to that kind of life is very important for a lot of people. And that's what comes through for me in the book, is that it's, it is a clear-eyed kind of, we need to live better and we need to have a society, but it's also sort of resurrecting it from being, Busby getting kicked under a train, and the British Rail doesn't work, and all those kind of things that regularly got thrown out.
I wanted to debunk a few widely held, I think, spurious myths, a received wisdom that's been passed down through, if you want to be very political about it, through the right wing's ownership of the media. So that's the soft power, the hegemony to transmit those ideas as if they were true. And also by a whole bunch of reductive pop culture documentaries on BBC4 that have reduced the 70s. I mean, Friday night comes around, I get my G&T and I watch them like everyone. But it's reduced quite a complicated decade to simply bin bags in the street, social, the dead unburied in the street. The 70s, early on, I quote brilliantly, there's an exchange on Twitter between Daniel Hannan, one of the chief architects of Brexit, who writes this article saying, the 70s, what an utterly wretched decade, it was such a terrible time to be alive. Daniel Hannan was only born in 1971 and in Peru. So as I said, he strikes me as a particularly sensitive and observant child. But Grace Maxwell, the great Grace Maxwell, wife of Edwyn Collins, the musician, replied to him by saying, I was 17 in 1976 or whatever. I left my council house, my clean, safe, well-run council house, affordable council house, to go, after having done my A-levels, to go and study at Glasgow University and embark on the great adventure of life with a full grant, and my parents got decent pay for the hard work that they did. Utterly wretched, my arse. We have been fed this idea that, I try gently and humorously to kind of change that. Wait a minute. Yeah. You had ABBA, you had Borg and McEnroe, you had the 70s were in many ways a great decade. We've been fed a myth that they were the decade that Stal forgot. If you were working class, your position in society, your earning power and your job security and your housing security were amazing. It was a great time to be working class. It wasn't a great time to be the chairman or a major shareholder in Rio Tinto Zinc. Yeah. It wasn't a great time to be a dictator of a failing third world country because the workers had some power. But that's what I mean. This has been somehow translated into, it was a bad time for everyone. Yeah. No, it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, of course, the inequality figures are always very interesting because that's the last period when inequality is lessening.
That's right.
From that point on, it starts to widen again slowly. And, you know, and the new Labour government of the 1990s did do small amounts around it and things like that. But now again, it's powering out. The question then always hangs over that conversation is, why did people reject it? Why did they shift to this ideology?
I think you can find some parallels now. I mean, with what's happened in the last few years in Britain, because people have signally voted against their own interests. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's a shocking thing to say. The people in the Red Wall who voted for Brexit and who voted for Boris Johnson, through any kind of objective measurement of the circumstances, have voted to reduce their own standard of living, have voted to make their own lives worse. So why? The only answer is that it's an emotional thing. And I've had arguments galore with my friends about Brexit. I didn't agree with Brexit, but I understood some of that, because for my last book, the Jarrow, where I recreated the Jarrow, I retraced the Jarrow March. So I walked. Basically, it was a walk from Brexit Britain to Remain Britain. Yeah. And I began to get a sense of people wanted to give, for better or worse and wrongly, some people who they saw as lording it over them a bloody nose. Yeah. And it was a wrong-headed thing to do. But in the case of the Brexit, I think that the Remain campaign was so poor. I mean, as I've said before, hey, it turns out that saying to people that they're an ignorant racist doesn't win them round to your argument. Who knew?
Strangely enough. Yeah.
And that's basically what the tenor of the Remain argument was. You're an ignorant racist if you vote for Brexit. When in fact, there is an extremely respectable left-wing critique of the European Union, but I never heard that being acknowledged. And I think similarly, it's been an emotional issue last time around. And I think I have to say, and this will get me into all kinds of trouble with certain people, I think you had to say we had an unelectable Labour Party. We had, in terms of ordinary, what I would call ordinary British people, not the Hampstead metropolitan, I think ordinary British people took one look at the modern Labour Party and thought they look like losers. Yeah. They look like people who are more interested in intellectual debate than what traditionally Labour has been, which is the party of the party of the industrial working class. Mm-hmm. Jeremy Corbyn came over as a man who was much more interested in Syria than Stockport. Mm-hmm. And I think these things matter. And again, I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying that's my feeling, that it was an emotional reaction to the climate of the times. And I think in 79, it might have been something like that as well, that they were told, oh, look, these striking, the striker is your enemy. When in fact, well, no, these are just people like you standing up for their rights, But
also, I mean, Jim Callaghan had been a senior Labour Party leader really since the 60s, and there didn't seem to be that kind of refreshment didn't happen. And I suppose there is a bit of a parallel in terms of, they got Michael Foot out from the back room, and they brought him forward. And to a certain extent, they did the same with Corbyn, although in a different manner of election.
I think it's very true.
And so you do get, I mean, I remember talking to my parents about 79, and obviously they would be not Tory voters, although they were living here in Northern Ireland at the time. But they said, that it was a slicker message, and it was put across more cleverly. And actually, it's very difficult when you are going to vote to actually know what a government is going to really do. Yeah. So you can sort of say, well, they say they're going to run the trains better, so why wouldn't I vote for them?
You got Saatchi ran a very, very slick campaign. Labour isn't working. Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, you have to say, whatever your politics, that is brilliant. In much the same way that Cummings, although now Dominic Cummings has slightly revealed himself to be the sort of, I think now, like that guy who you used to be at college with, who told you that who said that there was going to be, the Russians were going to invade the next day, and he kept like a lot of provisions in his rucksack, like the kind of the maverick thinker who's actually, I think he's starting to be revealed as that, the eccentric loner nutcase. But I do think it was very skillful. The skillful propagandist at the time of Brexit, take all those very simplistic phrases like taking back control and things like that. And I heard that when, if there was a danger of a second referendum, a danger from their point of view, if there was a danger of a second referendum on Brexit, he already had the phrase ready, tell them again, which is brilliant. I don't want, it's inimical to what I think, but it's brilliant. People sometimes forget, Corbyn's Labour Party forgot that. Corbyn's Labour Party, they would continually be saying to me, because I was not a Corbynista at all, they would continually be saying to me, but it's more than about slick messages, it's more than about slick PR, and I would say, it is, but you need a bit of slick PR.
Yeah.
Bevan knew that. Everybody knew that. And you cannot, this slightly puritanical, no, we will just wait for the electorate to smarten up and come to us. No, that's never going to work.
But also, if you're working, 24 hours a day, or 12-hour days, and coming home, you're an Amazon driver or something like that. How can you be across so many different policies? I mean, exactly. That's a sort of Chomsky kind of analysis of how modern society works. But there is a sense that there's so much going on, there's so much information there that actually, a quick and understandable message is much more powerful than any amount of nuance, really. And that makes things.
I'm a great pragmatist. I mean, I'm a great pragmatist in the fact that I think that you only affect change when you get your hands on the levers of power. So you've got to do that first. Otherwise, it's kind of showboating. It's drafty Islington Hall debating society. And some people, I think there have been people in the Labour Party who wanted that because the business of power, which Attlee relished and Bevan and Bevin relished and Wilson relished, there are some slightly monastic figures, I think, on the modern left who don't relish it because they know it's dirty work and it involves compromise. And they would rather keep their pure saintly image. I think Corbyn was like that. And I think a certain amount of realpolitik has to creep into the occasion. That's creeping into the occasion.
I mean, aspiration is always the term that's used whenever they're analysing the 1970s and into the 1980s. And this idea of, I wanted to own my own house. I didn't want to have a council house.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a confection, or do you think that there really was a sense within the working class that they, of the time, who were a much larger group of people in those days, that there was a sense that they wanted something different, that they wanted more agency, maybe, or something?
I think that's very true. I think you mustn't underestimate people's desire to. I mean, I think someone in the book says, I can't remember who it is now, it might be Catlin Moran, someone who says, I can't believe that we dismantled a whole decent system of running a country just so that someone could paint their front door a slightly different colour. But never underestimate the attraction of painting your front door a different colour. I mean, that's what brought down the Soviet Union. I mean, what brought down the Soviet Union, as well as massive geopolitical things, was that people wanted to buy Wham records and Levi's. Never underestimate that,
George Michael is a very powerful political force.
Exactly, yeah. And I do think that there was an element of that, and also a certain hard-headed. I know in the case of people I knew in Wigan, there was also a certain hard-headed. Well, it'll never be mine. But if I do this and it's mine, then I've got it. I don't have to keep paying rent. So there's a certain hard-headed pragmatism, and I don't think, again, maybe the message was put to them. Yeah, but you would have had that house for life and your kids under a decent system. Now it's going to become unaffordable and your kids will never own their own house, So I think, but those are rarefied concepts really to get over. Simply saying to people, you could have this. Also, they were bribed like hell. They were sold at a knockdown price. They were sold, certainly in England, at a criminally reduced price because it was it was a flagship ideological policy.
Yeah, so it had to work.
It had to work. Yeah,
they absolutely had to work. I mean, I think. Did you worry when you were writing the book that that you might be accused of nostalgia?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I did. I was aware that, and some of the more critiques I've agreed with. I mean, I was aware that I would get a grief from not from readers as much, but from those professionally obligated to have an opinion about it, I guess, reviewers and such, that I would get people who accuse me of being a centrist, certainly, because that was a very hot phrase when I was writing it a year or so ago, where the worst thing you could be was a centrist. And I think I was aware that I would get accused of that, particularly in the end where I go into a little riff about identity politics, and I said that we have replaced that sort of collectivity with a sense that that unfettered self-expression and personal liberation is the greatest goal of humankind, which I don't think it is.
Yeah.
And I think that has become an absolute totemic thing in the last few years, that you see it all the time. Self-empowerment, it's me, we become like the me generation again. And sometimes I think the idea, as you put it, of duty, of service, of class solidarity, of community, slightly become unfashionable notions. So I was aware that I'd get that. I think I was maybe not nostalgic, but romanticizing certain elements of the past. But some of the more sort of cogent criticisms I got, I think the FT, there was a review in the FT that was by and large flattering, but took me to task on certain points economically and said, you were wrong about this. Our GDP, and I'm not an expert on economics,
but
I'm not an expert on economics, and I'm quite willing to to be lectured on that. But mine is a more emotional thing, really, about the emotional health of the country. And I certainly think our emotional health, the emotional health of everyone, is much worse than it was in the 1970s.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, and I think it's very interesting for us here and in Ireland, I suppose. Watching across the Irish Sea in terms of what's going on in the UK, in GB and stuff like that. I mean, what's interesting there is how much it's changed in terms of Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland and the idea of the union. I mean, is the welfare state and the welfare state model the sort of thing that can actually bring people together? Have you had any thoughts about how the union gets affected by all this, and how the independence in Scotland and all these kind of elements?
I think that's interesting. I am aware that because it's written primarily from my experience, that I think it's bound to be slightly Anglo-centric view. But I do think that the fact that a shared national, I mean, it arises after the Second World War, and there's nothing like a war to get people to realise that we are all in this together. So I think to an extent you got a sense that from Belfast, from Belfast to Wrexham to Aberdeen, there was a sense of a collective national identity, and I think that was slightly dismantled post 1979 because it's sort of said that certain things cut through, and what cuts through is class. I very much believe that. I very much believe that, and I still believe now that any discussion about rights, any discussion about equitable nature things that doesn't address class right there at the beginning is window dressing. I mean, I say in the book that when John Humphreys went from the Today programme, a lot of liberal people were delighted because they thought he was a harumph-ing Tory. Yeah. It might have left it a more congenial listen, but it certainly left it a more class-divided one. Now the BBC does not have a single political presenter of the Today programme who didn't go to private school. Humphreys was a grammar school boy. And I say that because, I think to a degree, those issues cut through everything. I say in the book about on one level, having Michelle Hussain as a flagship presenter for the BBC is brilliant on one level. She's a woman of colour, she's a BAME woman. On the other hand, she's still the daughter of a 5-star Pakistani general who went to a very rich school. So things change, things seem to change for the better, but that one fundamental issue is the last great unaddressed inequality issue in British life, I think, and yet it cuts through everything else. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think back in the day, I think regional differences, as our politics has kind of fractured, I think regional differences become more into it. It certainly seems to pretty much everyone I speak to in England that we feel that Scotland and Wales seem to have addressed their situation in a more grown-up way than we have. I don't know if that's technically true, but I know there's a great deal of affection for Nicola Sturgeon in the bits of England I hang out in.
Well, yeah, and there is a sense of kind of. I think there's a lot of dissenting voices against Nicola Sturgeon, obviously, but I think that there's a sense of community still, and a sense of togetherness to a certain extent that doesn't appear to. I mean, watching on from away, England feels like a pretty divided place. Yeah, and it feels like a place that has been divided for quite some time. In the North-South divide in the 1980s and 1990s, those sort of issues didn't seem to be really addressed, and didn't seem to be really, a sense of national identity. But I think that's also wrapped up in that kind of, kind of idea of Britishness and thing. I mean, obviously, that can be dodgy ground speaking from Northern Ireland. But I mean, the experience of the welfare state is quite instructive. I mean, the Unionist government here in 1945 were forced to take on the NHS.
Right.
I mean, they really tried to resist it as much as possible, especially Social Security, unemployment benefit, and the sort of development of that sort of thing, on really ideological grounds. But also, and I think maybe some historians might disagree with me on this, but because the one thing about the welfare state was that it was an alternative centre of power, to use a political term, and which is presumably why ideologically in 1979 it had to go for Margaret Thatcher and friends, because actually it created new areas of power within society that hadn't necessarily existed before. So it empowered people, it gave people a safety net to develop and to try things and go, to develop educational systems and open libraries and all that sort of stuff. It's not a simple story that, Britain opened up in 1945. There's more to it than that. And, 1911 Act of Lloyd George and the breaking of the Lords and all that sort of stuff. But in Northern Ireland, it's very interesting. And sort of when you look across to England, actually a lot of the problems that happen here can very often be seen now in England. Different centres of power, quite fractured around the way that it regards itself. Do you flag a St George, or do you fly a Union Jack? Those kind of choices that people make.
Just to go back to what you said about 45 and the unionists, we also forget, because now the NHS is seen as a sort of secular sacrament by pretty much everyone. They have to. I mean, I don't think below the surface they think that. I think there are senior people in the Conservative Party who would love to privatise the National Service, and they're doing their best to do it. But I think it's become so romantically tied in with ourselves that no one would publicly say things like that. So we clap for the nurses. But in 45, the BMA and the Conservative government and the right-wing press were dead set against the welfare state. They thought it would become this mollycoddled land of communists. The BMA thought that their younger colleagues who wanted it were communists, and they thought that it would, they said, oh, it'll be doctors in uniforms marching to do the duty of the state, because it was all crap. And now we regard it as I say, a secular sacrament, the welfare state, albeit one that we're watching being dismantled in front of our eyes, kind of surreptitiously. And that's another thing that the book is sort of about, how we're ruled, the ruling class. I have no objection in using that rather old-fashioned Marxist term, but the ruling class is daily dismantling it whilst appearing not to, while using these weasel words like reform, streamlining. What that means is selling it off to their mates,
Yeah, absolutely. And making an ideological argument around that, about efficiency and about delivery and all those kind of things. I mean, it's interesting, all that stuff that John Major brought in about, consumer rights and choice and all that sort of stuff. I mean, the ideas sound good when you put them in, but when you see what they do to our overall system, then they can be very destructive. And that's certainly, I mean, I just find that the railways in England just terrifying. I mean, the amount of money it costs you to go from Manchester to London is prime peak time. It's just astonishing.
Oh, it's insane. It is not, as I say, it is not a grown-up way to run a country. No. And if you go almost anywhere else in the world, with the exception, of course, of America, who are, it's again, I say in the book, it's incredible to think that the might of America, and yet they still, some of their attitudes are the attitudes of like a toddler. They're like a gigantic toddler in many ways. But anywhere else you go in Europe, people will look at you askance and say, with things like, how much for a train ticket? Well, how do you get about? And the answer is, well, I guess we don't as much as other people. We don't, it's an extraordinary thing, privatization of water. But that's really the core of the book. We have for 40 years simply accepted this as progress, as how it has to be, but it doesn't have to be like this. It could have been very, very different,
Yeah, it was a very different story. There was one thing, you sort of talked about Brexit and how that all works. One of the interesting analysis at the moment of kind of British politics is the generational shift and divide. I saw a map earlier where it was 18 to 24-year-olds voting, it's essentially Labour, or right across the whole country. Yeah. If it's 65 or 55 and upwards, it's entirely blue. I mean, does that feel like the 70s to you? Does it feel like it kind of, that there's a divide in the way, in attitudes that can't really be bridged?
The generation gap, I think, is absolutely back, because I think the things that even I, and the generation before me, kind of took for granted, absolutely took for granted. And now, young people absolutely can't. You can't take it for granted that you not only, it's not absolutely imperative that you do own your own house. Most Norwegians and Swiss people don't, because they've got a much more sensible rental system. But even to be able to afford to rent somewhere decent near where you work, all the things that we talk. I was always being told when I was a kid by my dad, oh, it was different for you because, you've got unemployment. I left school at 50 and I had my pick of jobs. Yeah. So we were kind of hard done to, but that position seems to have got even worse now. So I don't, with intern culture and I take your point. I guess in some ways, if you were a right-wing thinker, a right-wing strategist, it's very worrying, but it's almost like a generational time bomb, isn't it? Yeah. Unless you share that opinion that everyone, when they get to 30 or 40, becomes a Tory, which I don't.
Yeah, no.
That is a generational time bomb in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit like, Radio 3 and Radio 4's aging listenership. They've got to get those, and indeed the BBC, you've got to get those young, you know.
Yeah. I mean, the chapter on the media is very interesting. I mean, obviously, because of your experience in terms of both working for the Beeb and the big institutions, but also independent TV companies, and you know, when the market was opened up within the BBC and all those kind of things. And I thought that was all very interesting. How, you know, the obsession with youth. There's a term for it. Is it refreshers or something like that?
Replenishers.
Yeah, replenishers.
Replenishers. Yeah.
Isn't that lovely? That's what people are now. Go on.
No, it's interesting. Obviously, viewed from a point of view, you need to get younger listeners. But but I'm slightly worried sometimes that it's a bit like attracting more working class viewers. That's something that they are belatedly addressing. I talked to Alan Davey, who's the class czar, as it were. And whilst they are addressing that issue, I sometimes balk a bit when I hear the accents and I see that there's a slight but perceptible equation of working class with down market. And I think that's a very dangerous route to go on. You know, working class people want quality entertainment and interesting documentaries as much as everyone else. But I think there's a slight feeling amongst some of the middle class people out high up in the BBC that, you know, sort of Attenborough's for middle class people. No, Attenborough's for everyone. You know what I mean? And I think there's a slight feeling of that, and but we need to give the plebs a bit of something they'll enjoy. But I think that's a misreading of the situation. It's a dangerous misreading. I think, you know, I whilst I understand the BBC's dilemma, I think there are ways of going about things that are, you know, there are ways. I mean, as I say in the book, it might be time to accept the license fee as an anachronism. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I know that within the BBC, there's much debate about that.
I think it's difficult. I mean, I think it's one of the last institutions left that's actually right across the whole of the UK. I mean, you know, in terms of devolution and the army and presumably the HMRC, Inland Revenue as well, are really the last three sort of things standing. Yeah. I find it very odd that people who profess to be, you know, kind of very interested in the union and very interested in keeping it together are also very interested in getting rid of the BBC. It's sort of, you know, there's a slight dissonance in how that works.
It's a bit like you said that I think the right, I mean, well, we mustn't forget though, there was no more volatile, vocal critic of the BBC than Alistair Campbell. I mean, this is, But I think what you said about the National Health Services and the welfare state is very true. I think the BBC, to some people on the right, is an alternative centre of power. Yeah. It represents a voice that will not simply say what you want it to say, or it shouldn't do. I mean, I know there's a massive amount of debate about that at the moment. But the idea is that I do think the BBC still has this idea that it is the voice, for better or worse, of truth. I mean, I said to James Purnell in the book, I said, you know, that old thing that like my very left-wing friends said that we're a tool of the government and the government think we're a lot of pinkos. So that must mean we're doing something right. And he quite quickly jumped on that and said, no, I don't buy that argument, Stuart. It might mean we're doing everything wrong. But and I take his point. Yeah. But I do think there is a certain feeling of that. I mean, it's like it goes back to Churchill in the Second World War. Churchill thought it in the Second World War. Not Churchill himself, actually, so much as some people around him thought that the BBC should not report accurately, that it should actually provide distorted bulletins that are good for morale. That's interesting, really. I mean, I can see the point. I don't agree with it, but I can see the point because they said it was the state broadcaster. And of course, they said, no, we are not. We are a voice of truth. And I think it is an alternative centre of power. It is an alternative voice. And I think that's why some people on the left and the right don't trust it.
No, I think that's very true. You mentioned revisions. What sort of changes are you going to make for the paperback edition?
Some of them are very minor. Some of them are simply that, you know, I've said, you know, it's events have transpired to Chris Grayling his position has changed and things like that. So some of them are just very simple tweaks like that. But some of them are just a sentence here and there that I needed to put in. Just before I was talking to you, I was going through the chapter on the dole and the section in that on universal basic income. And in that, I write quite positively about universal basic income, saying it's an idea whose time has come. And I've just put a couple of extra sentences in saying we surely have seen that through the last few months. Because I mean, what was Rishi Sunak's furlough scheme, if not a form, albeit sketchily applied and inequitable, but it was a form of universal basic income. And Absolutely. I think now is the moment to think that's what we should have. Universal basic income.
It's quite interesting that they've rowed back so hard from it as well. In terms of, you know, I think it spooked a lot of members of the Conservative Party when they did it. Because it did, yeah, you're right. It just looked like a furlough scheme. It looked, you know, it looked like a UBI.
It looked like UBI.
Yeah.
It looked like UBI, but I think we may be realizing that. And of course, people say, how can we afford it? And of course, then you go down the route of, well, you could make Amazon pay some tax.
Yeah.
Start. But I think it's UBI, just that one point. It's never been a particularly political thing. That, as I say in the book, Nixon was very keen on it.
Yeah.
And I think it just feels like an idea whose time has come. And I think this has shown us that. And what the main thing I want to revisit is I've not decided yet whether to add a bit at the end or to entirely rewrite the last chapter, because I take as one of my kind of riffs, if you like, in the last chapter, the Eyam in Derbyshire.
Yeah.
The village that isolated itself, self-isolated, as we would now say, to not transmit the plague. And I say that, I wonder aloud in that section, would we do that now? Are we this idea of individual self-empowerment and liberation, would we do that? Would we, as a people, would we say, no, I will maybe die, but other people will live? And I think, so but the whole self-isolation in COVID means I've really got to address that issue and say that I think we found out to a degree that we would do it. I mean, all right, we went and panic bought loo rolls and we did all kinds of stupid things like that. But in essence, it's brought that urgently into the public debate now about, you know, masks and isolation. And the whole focus of the debate has been, don't just keep yourself safe, keep other people safe. So it's brought that right. So I'll have to think of a way of addressing that. And,
it's very interesting. I mean, the role of the state suddenly has become, you know, taken for granted now, you know, what the government does and how it does it, but also the prevarications around, you know, having a very right-wing Tory government in power and how they feel about that. You know, emotionally. I read an interesting article the other day that sort of was arguing that actually, you know, they don't look like Thatcherites and they don't talk like Thatcherites, but they are delivering what Thatcher never could in terms of what they're going to do further down the line and things like that. So this has thrown a total curveball in you know, their strategy and their overall strategy. It's quite interesting.
It's interesting that in the early days, now we're just seeing the whole thing unraveling.
Yeah.
I thought the early part of lockdown was really interesting because you suddenly saw Rishi Sunak kind of emerging as this figure who was basically the most statist, I'm going to throw money at this, you know, strong. But I think what's interesting in the early days is that we were applauding nurses and the business community that we've been encouraged to admire for so many years produced all these villains. So straight away, people looked at Philip Green and Branson and said, hang on. And there was a sort of almost a wartime mood of, you're not, this is unpatriotic what you're doing, asking for bailouts. Now, I don't know if that mood, and I'll address this when I come to the concluding bit of the book, will we be changed forever by this? I'm not such of a romantic to think we will, but I think we will to a degree. I think people will be less inclined to say, oh, you know, cabbies will be less inclined to say, oh, Richard Branson and Philip Green, who can blame them winning a big bit of money? I think people will remember how they sacked people, or how they're not sacked, but how they, you know, threw the workers out of, you know, said to the workers, you've not got a job. I think they will remember how quickly they went to the government, cap in hand. These people have private islands, you know. I think it was the haste was unseemly, to say the least. You know,
and what British Airways did as well.
Yeah.
Well, Stuart, it's lovely to talk to you, and thank you very much. Just a reminder, everyone, that the book is available from No Alibis and Tertulia in Westport, and I believe that they are going to be signed copies. I think. Have you got book plates and all that sort of stuff?
I think we're doing that.
We're going to defeat COVID and get signed copies out to people. Stuart, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really
Thank you, Hugh. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
And good luck with the paperback revisions, and good luck with the fight.
Thank you.